So this is the top of Mingus Mountain. It's there's a campground. There's a couple of campgrounds up here. There used to be a little store. I called it a hunter store, but I think that's closed down. So there's a couple of campgrounds up here, and the temperature is beautiful. I think it's about 76 degrees up here. Right now in Phoenix, it's probably about 107. Down in Prescott, it's probably 85, 86. Up here, it's about 74. So it's absolutely beautiful. But then you start down the other side, and you can see it's all pine forest. There's places to pull out in case your car is overheating, or, you know, you want to get out and stretch your legs, walk through the forest. So there's that. But as I said, about halfway down, we're going to come to the town of Jerome. Now, Jerome is where it is because they discovered copper in Mingus Mountain. At the time, they didn't know how much, but it was enough to mine. So they started mining the copper, and the more copper they found, the more miners came up the mountain to mine. So they built a town called Jerome. It was named after the guy that owned the copper mine, and the guy that owned the copper mine had a beautiful house in Jerome. It's a museum now. It talks about the history of Jerome and the copper mine. And literally, the town of Jerome was built on top of the mine. So the more copper they took out of the mountain, the more hollow it got underneath Jerome, and Jerome started sliding down the mountain. But it was sliding down the mountain in one piece, as a whole town, not individual pieces a little bit at a time. And today you can see where things have moved, where it's slid down the mountain ways. And I'm talking about feet, not inches. It slid down the mountain probably anywhere from 6 to 15 feet. And people would just shore up the buildings or rebuild the foundations or reframe the house or the building, you know, whatever it was, making sure that they still had a place to live in Jerome. And Jerome is still there. It's an artist community now. The mine dried out. It never had a bad thing happen to the mine. It didn't cave in or explode or anything like that, like you read about or hear about today. It just, all of a sudden the copper wasn't there anymore. So they just closed it up. They didn't bother to fill it back in. They just closed it up. As far as I know, it's still hollow under Jerome. But Jerome became, well, almost a ghost town at first. We used to, when we would go vote, we had to vote in the House of Prostitution, which always struck me as appropriate. But anyway, when we came over to vote, we'd go to the House of Prostitution, which it wasn't by then. It was just a building, but it was still, everybody knew what it was originally in the town of Jerome. And we'd vote, and then we'd drive back over this road to go back home. There was a schoolhouse, two-story schoolhouse. They took the schoolhouse and turned it into an artist's industry where artists could go and rent space in the schoolhouse to work on their art and their ability to do art. And you could go through the schoolhouse and look at the different artists that were doing art in the schoolhouse. I think they still do that. And there are some bed and breakfasts there now, and restaurants and things like that. It's become a booming recreation spot. And then as they mined the copper, they needed a place to smelt the copper. Well, they couldn't bring it over the mountain to this side, and they couldn't build a smelter on the side of the mountain. So down in the valley, the Verde Valley, you'll see that when we get back over this hill, they built a smelter, and a town popped up around it called Clarkdale, because Clark was the name of the guy that owned or built the smelter. So the ore that they would mine out of the copper mine was taken down to Verde Valley, to Clarkdale, to be smelted into copper. Now, a byproduct of smelting copper is sulfur, a lot of sulfur. They took a lot of copper out of the mountain. And there are entire, I would call it acreages, where they would dump the smelter water that had the sulfur in it. And when you drive through there, there are warning signs up not to throw cigarettes or anything, any flame, out your car window, for fear that you'll catch the sulfur on fire, and the sulfur will burn. It's still there today. They haven't done anything with it. They haven't covered it up or anything. It's just laying on the ground down there, part of the process of smelting the copper. That's the Verde Valley straight ahead. You can see in that town at the bottom there, that's Clarkdale. Well, Cottonwood and Clarkdale. Okay, but that's Clarkdale. And that's where they smelted the copper. So the first part of this road that was built is the part of the road that went from Jerome by horse-drawn carriage, horse-drawn wagon, down to Clarkdale to carry the ore down, so that the copper could be smelted and sold. I don't know when they built this side of the road. But Prescott, because of all the mining around Prescott, Prescott became the territorial government, the territorial capital. And it stayed that way till Arizona became a state, and it was decided that Prescott wasn't centrally located enough to be the capital, so the capital became Phoenix. But back in the territory days, the discussion was whether or not it should be Tombstone, Tucson, or Prescott. And Prescott won out because it was more centrally located than Tucson or Tombstone. So we're still going down to the north side of Mingus Mountain. We've got just a little ways further to go, but not far. And in just a minute, we'll come into Jerome. Once we get around this last turn, you'll start seeing the mine tailings. Now that isn't, they won't be of the big mine, the mine that's under Jerome. They've closed that off, so people can't go into the mine. It's too dangerous. It hasn't been open for anybody to go down into it, I don't think, for decades. But there are a couple of little mines that were built or worked along at the same time, and so you'll see some mine tailings from other copper mines other than the mine that was under Jerome. It's not, none of them are worked anymore. But there's one right there. And you can see how much ground or material has been taken out of that mine. And that's the kind of mining they did here. It was closed shaft mining with tailings just being dumped down the mountainside. They've shored up the side of the mountains in places to keep the roads from washing away completely. I guess it's working. Hope it's working. Now I know it's doing that. So we're entering the Verde Valley, but we're not in the valley yet. And you can see this is an overlook, so you can look over the Verde Valley and see the canyon that was all part of this. And so that's the Verde Valley. The little town on the left is Clarkdale. The town further over on the right, that's Cottonwood. And now you can start to see Jerome. When we come around the bend, we'll cross the city limits. And you can see what I mean by how the town was built on the side of the mountain. We're at 5,000 feet, which means the top of the mountain was probably around 7,500. And you can see how the roofs of the buildings on the right-hand side of the road are floor level to the buildings on the left side of the road. It's just the way Jerome was built. It did burn down one time. They had a big fire. I don't remember the whole story, but just like all stories about mining towns and fire, Jerome was in drastic shape for a while after the fire, but it just built itself back up. It just put itself back together. That's the museum down there. That's the owner's house right there. And this is downtown. So, wine tasting, hotels, artifacts, knickknacks. And we're coasting. And see right there where it says Bordello Jerome? That's where we voted. That, that was where we came to vote. Right there. And there's another level you can see right there. A couple of Verde Valley vineyards have wine tasting spaces. Hotels, B&Bs, bed and breakfast. Just a little place of heaven on the side of a mountain. First time I've ever seen that. I don't think Jerome has a police department. I think it's done through the sheriffs, the Verde Valley Sheriff. I don't know if you can hear from the engine, but we've been coasting for 3 or 4 minutes now. I don't think we're going fast enough to coast up this hill. I'll have to I remember this is the road that they used horse-drawn wagons to get the copper ore down to Clarkdale to the smelter. You can imagine what that road was like, what that trip was like.